Okay. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that if you have multiple subdivisions for your object, you can't actually flatten the mesh. So if I subdivide this mesh several times and go to flatten, it'll give us an error message. We'll go ahead and undo and go back to the lowest subdivision level, and if we look in our geometry menu, you'll notice no subdivision history. What's interesting about this, though, is that if we flatten the mesh, because this is actually 3D geometry, there's absolutely nothing stopping us from subdividing the mesh at this point. So if I go into geometry and divide, 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 I'm now working with a 1,000,000 poly object. A couple of interesting things then become possible with this. First and foremost, let's talk about poly paint. If I simply go into the standard brush, choose a color again, I'll go ahead and remove the wireframes. You'll notice that I can still, or at this point, we'll turn the wireframes back on, I can now again poly paint onto this object. Let's turn off deformation and make sure that just color is turned on. And you'll notice at this point, having undone what I did, we lost the ability to unflatten the object. This will happen on occasion, so we're going to undo until we can get back to its base state, then we'll flatten it again. Alright. With it flattened, we'll go ahead and subdivide up to about 1,000,000 polygons. And now, in RGB mode, standard brush, we'll go ahead and poly paint on like we did before. This is just for proof of concept to show that we can do it. Now, what's interesting about this is while the Morph UV didn't give us the option to apply that back to a texture map, we actually have that option now that we're using the flattened version. So this becomes very interesting. If we go into our UV map, we'll choose 2048, and we can choose now New from Polypaint. This texture then can be cloned out and applied back to our other object. So what this means is we now have the ability to polypaint on flattened objects and then create textures and apply them back to our three-dimensional objects. In essence, we can now texture on the flattened version of the mesh, which wasn't really possible before. I'll go ahead and turn that off, and I'll go ahead and fill the object with a white color. Now, this also opens the door to begin utilizing all of ZBrush's other tools. So, for example, if I wanted to texture the entire object in the round, I can now activate something like Spotlight. We'll go ahead and load in just any random texture. This one will do fine. We'll load that into Spotlight. I'll go ahead and shrink that down just a little bit. I'll increase the Spotlight radius, and then I'll pin that to the Spotlight tool. We'll turn off the Spotlight by pressing Z, and now you'll notice that we can actually begin to paint with this. With this at 1,000,000 polygons, and still, again, checking to make sure that we can unflatten it if necessary, we can begin to paint texture deformation onto the flattened version of the object. This allows us to texture the object rapidly, very, very quickly, all the way around. Of course, this information can then be transferred directly back to a mesh or to a texture map. We'll go ahead and do New from Polypaint, and you'll see it right back onto the object again. At this point, I'll clone that so it's not tied necessarily to this tool. We'll drop down to the lowest subdivision level. We actually really don't need to drop down to the lowest subdivision level, but just for the sake of the argument, if at 1,000,000 polygons we attempt to unflatten, it will tell us at this point that the topology of the mesh has changed. And if we ask it to transfer this back to the lowest resolution mesh by saying yes, it'll tell us that that was just not possible. Now, what we're seeing here at this point is the texture map on the object. Okay? So what we've effectively done now is leverage the fact that we can open up UV Master. We can flatten our object out flat. We can now utilize the texture painting capabilities inside of ZBrush, both poly painting and with Spotlight, to rapidly texture our entire object all at once. This can then be transferred back onto the object, and we can fix any seams that are left. So that in and of itself is a very powerful and useful feature of working with UV Master. Let's take a look at one last option for this. We'll go ahead and turn off the texture. We'll go ahead and flatten this object out one more time. Now that it's flattened, and again, no geometry because you can't flatten an object with multiple subdivision levels. We'll go ahead and subdivide this up into the million poly mark. Now, just to make life a little bit easier, we'll go ahead and zoom in. I'll switch over to the standard brush. I'm going to turn off spotlight by hitting Shift Z right now. I'll go into drag rectangle, and this, again, just as a proof of concept, we'll go ahead and turn on deformation by turning on Z add. We'll turn off poly paint as well. I'll increase the Z intensity, and I'm just going to begin to draw in some deformation to this object. Again, useful for us to be able to texture the entire object all at once. When we're finished with this, you'll notice if we try to unflatten again, it's going to tell us that we can't do this. It'll ask us if we want to transfer the results. We already know that that's not going to work, so we're going to say cancel. Having done that, we've lost the ability to work on the mesh. So again, I'll undo until we get rid of that extra deformation. And now we'll flatten the object out again. Not sure exactly why that happens, but when it does, easy to work around. So subdivide the object up to about 1,000,000 polygons again. Now that we've got that 1,000,000 poly mark, we'll go ahead and again simply draw in deformation all over the object. So to get this deformation off of the object and then back on to our model again, we can use a displacement map. And what's interesting about this is because this is actual geometry and it has a subdivision history, we can make a displacement map just like we normally would. So we'll go into the UV map section, make sure we're using a reasonable size map for this. We'll open up the displacement map settings. I'll turn on adaptive and keep smooth UV on, and I'll just hit create displacement map. Let's go ahead and find out what's happening with that. Back into displacement map. Map cannot be created while the highest subdivision level is active. Switch to a lower subdivision level. Duh. Thunk. All the way down to 1. Alright, let's try this again. Into displacement map. Create displacement map. It's going to look at the higher subdivision levels and transfer the deformation back onto the map. When it's finished, it'll apply that and we'll see it projected onto the low-res mesh. Okay. Also bringing back our texture map, we'll go ahead and turn that off for right now. Now, with this displacement map, it also noted its alpha depth, which is good. We'll go ahead and clone the displacement map, putting it over into our alpha menu so we can reapply it. Now, we'll go ahead and unflatten our object. We can now go back over to our original object that had the deformation levels. We'll subdivide this up to about 1,000,000 polygons. We'll come back into the displacement map options. We'll choose the map that we just created. That's the stars. We'll turn the displacement map on. We'll go into mode so this becomes an actual 3D deformation. Let's go ahead and get rid of the red texture so we can see that just a little bit better. So we can see that projected onto our object. Now, you'll also notice that the intensity is set as it was for this displacement. So if I simply apply the displacement map back to the object at this point, we're now dealing with actual 3D deformation over the surface of the object. So simply by leveraging the power of UV Master, we're able to do some things that we weren't easily possible before. We're able to edit the UV geometry inside the UV space, which is nice. We're also able to polypaint onto our object and to basically do textures using the new spotlight feature. And then third, we're able to actually apply deformation to the entire object all at once, seeing the deformation, and then we can apply this back using the displacement map option to our regular object. So I hope you found that useful. There's some interesting things that we can now do with the UV Master tool.